was showing people ferns at the block of Kyle, including this magnificent Dryopteris emula, for the umpteenth time, perfectly valid questions were asked for which I had no helpful answers. I could only refine the questions. This always happens when I teach people about ferns, and it's good to have people appreciate that there's so much we have yet to learn, but we are also frustrated not to have the answers we want. Of course, we speculate as best we can, but that's rarely entirely satisfactory. Therefore, I light-heartedly propose that someone in the party might wish to find out for us, asking if anyone fancies taking on a PhD project. That's not an entirely unserious idea. It's always possible that somebody, one day, will accept a challenge. This year, 2026, I have found myself confronted with some more questions requiring biological answers. Their own PhD challenge, proposed in the notes below, will become apparent as this video progresses. This video speculates about generally unnoticed and subtle but potentially significant variation in the common male fern, Dryopteris Filix-Mas. Botany progresses. Originally there used to be only 2 British male ferns, then 3, then 5, and now, thanks to advances in molecular genetics, 9 or 10 recognised major taxa. Whether they are all species is a cause of lively, ongoing debate. Only one species concerns us here. That's the common male fern, which is indeed common, having been found in all but 20 of the almost 4,000 10-kilometre squares of land in Britain and Ireland. It's considered to be a single species with little variation in the wild type other than that imposed on it by local environmental conditions. The common male fern is predominantly a woodland plant, but it adapts to many other habitats, some quite eccentric. Waysides. Dry stone and mortared walls. Damp walls by leaky drain pipes. It can grow epiphytically, here on the mossy trunk of an ancient Highland rowan tree. It even adapts to the grikes in limestone pavement. This presentation is about variation in the fern's sori, the little dots that occupy the undersides of the fronds of the common male fern, Dryopteris Filix-Mas. Here are 2 sori, singular, sorus. Each consists of a heap of spore capsules, the sporangia, singular sporangium, protected by an umbrella-like indusium, plural indusia. As the sporangia mature, the indusia desiccate, lifting, splitting or rolling up into a cone, exposing the sporangia to the air so that they may deliver their spores into the breeze. We will consider the morphology of the sori of Dryopteris Filix-Mas, which in conventional descriptions are said, implied always, to have thin, loose and overlapping indusia, as shown here. Here are example descriptions from 4 authorities. Professor Irene Manton, 1950. The margin of the indusium lies flat on the surface of the leaf and is not tucked under the sorus. Clive Jermy and Josephine Camus, 1998. Indusium, thin, surface smooth, margin initially flattened and spreading, often overlapping neighbouring indusia, shrivelling to form a chanterelle, often shed before the spores and mostly absent on previous year's leaves. Christopher Page, 1997. Each indusium is like an inverted soup plate in shape, with flattened edges spreading out all around, instead of donut-shaped and tucked under the developing sporangia, as in D. affinis. Now, my own first description in 1992. Indusia, thin, spread loosely at the margin and overlap, shrivel completely as spores mature and are shed at spore release. However, Merriweather 2020, the indusia are loose, voluminous, their margins spreading irregularly and overlapping. Unfortunately, some D. Filix-Mas do have tucked under indusia, mandating that other characters should be assessed. I was beginning to recognise that there was a problem. While those descriptions are true, many plants of the same species have thicker, tucked under indusia, as in the top right, an anomaly which hasn't really received botanical attention. As spore release approaches, the indusia behave differently according to their structure. If they're thin, they shrink and roll up into little cones, but when they're thick, they retain their shape and just lift. as described in the conventional literature, and below as frequently observed. Once you've noticed, it's very difficult to ignore this difference. A closer view taken in the early season, conventional, and here as often observed. Then, at the time of spore dispersal, conventional, and here as frequently observed. Returning to those authoritative descriptions which suggest that D. Filix-Mas Indusia are universally deciduous, I wonder where we got that from. It was simply common knowledge among British pteridologists for years. Now we can see that that feature is dependent upon which class of D. Filix-Mas is being observed. As we might now expect, thin, spreading Indusia are generally lost, while the thicker, tucked-under sorts tend to be persistent. So it has become evident that the anatomy and behaviour of the Indusia of the common male fern are not as straightforward as had been generally presumed. This situation is particularly unhelpful to observant botanists making their first steps in fern identification. These people were using my Field Studies Council guide, which might have been misleading depending on which sort of common male fern they had to work on. But there's more. While we're considering dogmatic descriptions of the common male fern, we should consider that purported definitive dark spot or patch at the junction of rachis and costa on the underside or back of the frond, used to differentiate the common and mountain male ferns from the rest of the male ferns. It is often stated that these two consistently lack the dark spot that the others clearly display. That feature is actually quite unreliable, and here's why. Like all the other young pteridologists of my time, I was taught that only the diaphanous aggregate ferns has this dark patch, while D. Filix-Mas and D. Oreades by definition lacked it. Here are typical cases, but I'm afraid honest observation shows that to be not always true. Let's briefly zoom in on a common male fern example which beautifully conforms with dogmatic field guide descriptions, both in its lack of a dark patch and its spreading Indusia. And next another, later in the season, still conforming. But this one, although the Indusia have conformed, the lack of a dark patch has not. There are several manifestations of this anomaly, ranging from slightly brown to distinct, as here. When putting this video together in late July, I popped out into the garden to see what my male ferns were doing. This large common male fern showed a suite of factors that could confuse the beginner. Under the scales of fronds 1 and 2, a small dark patch is lurking, which could be confirmed by scraping them away. In 3, a dark stripe running along most of the lower part of the rachis runs right over where a dark patch ought not to be. The mountain male fern, however, was retaining its green at the junction of the costa and rachis, but to add to the confusion, this year the Indusia were behaving atypically. Characteristically, they're quite thick with a membranous margin. While a few might split, mostly they just lift and contract, while that margin makes many of them look like minute, untidy mobcaps. This year most are splitting dramatically, as they would normally in diaphanous. That the past 2 weeks have been unusually hot and dry may provide the answer. All of this clearly warns that we should not presume that all ferns will slavishly match textbook descriptions. Additional confusion may be caused by the darkening of both the rachis and the costa of the aphanis group, meaning that where the dark patch ought to be found, it's all dark and a discrete patch undetectable. In this specimen the costa is green, so that, with the scales scraped away, a dark patch is evident. However, this situation is often encountered where the coloration of the dark patch continues along the costa, sometimes all the way, and even right the way down the rachis and stipe. In his book, Chris Page offered advice about male fern identification that is surely encouraging but also perplexing, because it is often very difficult or even impossible to determine which species is which. The satisfactory morphological identification of all of the British and Irish variants of this taxonomically very complex group of species usually requires a symphony of characters to be taken into simultaneous account. While learning about them, we hatched a name and a handy expedient for the many we simply can't name. We call them WOBs, an anxiety relief acronym for Walk On By. If you take on male ferns for the sake of your sanity, please also adopt this attitude. You don't know, so walk on by. I've tried to overlook these tricky anomalies, but the honest part of my brain keeps nagging at me to notice. So let's return to those annoying sori with reference to a few days spent in West Yorkshire, which persuaded me that I needed to do something about it. All these thoughts were provoked by an August 2025 encounter with a male fern growing in a narrow strip of land between the house and the garden wall of a property in the West Yorkshire village of Heptonstall. At first glance, I just presumed it was as expected for a lowland garden, the common male fern Dryopteris Filix-Mas, but it didn't look quite right. The pinnules were parallel-sided rather than tapering, each with a rounded apex, and their pinnae were longitudinally convex, very much in the style of Dryopteris oreades. Also, like oreades, the Indusia of the maturing sori were robust and lifting above the ripe sporangia. Many had those thin margins characteristic of oreades. Here they are in July 2026, compared with those of a highland plant at a slightly later date. Very oreades. So I contacted Fern Society colleagues, asking them for an opinion about this picture without stating mine. They agreed that this plant most resembles Dryopteris oreades. The Heptonstall male fern's stature approaching 1 metre was superficially more characteristic of D. Filix-Mas, though large plants of D. oreades do grow at low altitudes, such as in the churchyard of Grange in Borrowdale, Cumbria, which would add support to the D. oreades identification. This discovery led to a series of male fern assessments through the village, though only that garden specimen resembled D. oreades. All were convincing D. Filix-Mas except that most bore sori with tucked under, robust-looking Indusia, not conforming to typical descriptions. The following day we visited the moors above the Bronte waterfall, setting off from Stanbury, where I became distracted by numerous common male ferns along the lane running uphill from the very adequate parking lay-by. This was the first time I'd looked properly at and begun wondering about a robust oreades-like form of indusium in Dryopteris Filix-Mas, and thereafter see it as a significant feature. If anyone wishes to check these plants, here are the necessary directions. First, park and walk. 2 of the plants I photographed in detail, which are included below, are labelled Stanbury specimens 1 and 2. Let's compare these various sori and their indusia. Here are the sori of conventional Filix-Mas matching field guide descriptions. And here the sori of conventional oreades. Next, the sori of West Yorkshire Filix-Mas plants, such as I found in various places, though still in West Yorkshire occasionally they conform to convention. What might be deduces going on here? Let's have a look at the proposed ancestry of the British male ferns, their evolution as determined from their chromosomes and molecular genetics, with particular reference, of course, to our common male fern Dryopteris Filix-Mas. Here is the British male ferns family tree, as best we can know it. First, let's quickly look at the origins of all except Dryopteris Filix-Mas. It will probably be best not to try to follow the arrows too closely without pausing for a while. Dryopteris oreades is a basic ancestor of all British male ferns, so to be relevant in this complicated lattice, it appears twice. It has the basic 2 sets of chromosomes, so it's diploid, and reproduces with both male and female gametes, a property shared among the British male ferns with only Dryopteris Filix-Mas. All of the Dryopteris affinis aggregate ferns, whether the common 3 or the many more currently under investigation, have 3 chromosome sets, so they're triploid and infertile and have only male organs. Therefore, they reproduce asexually and do so very successfully. Now we'll return to D. Filix-Mas and 2 of the other species in this male fern complex. Sometime in the past, hybridization occurred between Dryopteris oreades and Dryopteris caucasica, with, at some point in the process, doubling of the hybrid's chromosome complement. Abrupt speciation like this has happened a lot in ferns. See my Polypodium and Polystichum videos. The resultant offspring of those two diploid species was a new tetraploid species. Whether the F1 hybrid was capable of reproduction is not known, so in which generation chromosome doubling occurred is also unknown. So that's the origin of Britain's commonest male fern. That mysterious parent, Dryopteris caucasica, is now found mostly in Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, the Caucasus, and northern Spain, where its distribution today still overlaps with Dryopteris. Did it once grow in Britain, or has Dryopteris Filix-Mas migrated across Europe to here? Its similarity to Filix-Mas is a bit perplexing, though perhaps the Indusia are even thinner and thus shrivel more readily. Comparing these three species, D. caucasica has thin or very thin Indusia, which shrivel as the sporangia ripen. Dryopteris has thick Indusia, which remain more or less intact and rise. Then classically the Indusia of D. Filix-Mas tend to be intermediate, rolling rather than shrivelling completely. But, as we've seen, on many plants they are more like the Indusia of Dryopteris. This is worthy of discussion. Is there a plausible explanation for these observations? We can speculate. Dryopteris oreades has the robust, persistent Indusia at least partially and noticeably expressed by many West Yorkshire plants which, other than their robust Indusia, completely match descriptions of D. Filix-Mas. Is that possibly a reflection of exposure to the elements? That could easily be determined by data gathering. However, genetics might provide a better explanation. Differences between the various forms of Dryopteris Filix-Mas might be expressions of the species' degree of genetic heterogeneity, the significance of which is not usually discussed. If the ideas proposed above were to gain traction among field pteridologists and novel research conducted using modern methodologies, Dryopteris Filix-Mas might become better understood as a polymorphic species by differential indusium determining gene expression. There is also the possibility that the tetraploid hybrid has evolved several times, with the emergence of several slightly different morphotypes. If variability is not the result of multiple hybridizations, as a sexual species, D. Filix-Mas has the genetic potential to express a variety of character states in its offspring of either of its quite distinct parents. In either of these hypothetical cases, it might be that, while being the same species as currently defined, it is more variable in its detail than has been previously supposed. What should we do about these undeniable puzzles about our commonest male fern? The needs of all plant recorders need to be satisfied, and we who have some understanding of the capriciousness of fern biology have a responsibility to them and to Britain's biodiversity to make identifications work for them. Future field guides should not be so pedantic about characters we can demonstrate are variable. That will require further fieldwork and genetical investigation so that previously unnoticed, subtly different but significant forms of the common male fern can be split or lumped. Field botanists need the best information we can provide. If you agree that the pteridological questions raised in this video and others on this channel are valid, please consider embarking on a serious research project which might provide us with answers.